My name is Dr. Ian Ralby, and it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to this second event in our series on the craft of compromise. On behalf of the board of the Henry Clay Center for Statesmanship, I am delighted to have you all here with us today. Last month, we had the opportunity to sit down with our honorary co-chairs, former Senators Trent Lott and Tom Daschle, and we discussed the skills and the values needed to address the most complex problems in our society today. Over the course of that conversation, not only did we bring out some of the key foundational principles for how we address the most difficult and, in some cases, emotional problems that face our society, but we also got to see on display two men who spent their entire careers in opposition to each other, engaging with each other with mutual respect, friendship, and indeed deference to their experiences, their insights, and their character. If you haven't seen it, I commend it to you because it really was a tremendous example of how we can engage with each other even when we don't agree. In today's iteration, we are going to be trying to put to test the skills and values that came out of that conversation. Now, if I were going to try to distill what was said last month into just a few words, it would be quite a task. But let me give it a chance. First, we talked about communication, and that includes two aspects. One is being clear in how we express our needs, our interests, our desires, but it also means listening aggressively to each other so that we actually try to understand the other side, the other position, the other interests, the other needs. So communication is foundational, but that is not all, because chemistry is also incredibly important. Now, Senators Lott and Daschle talk about chemistry throughout their public appearances all over, and they write about it in their book called Crisis Point. But if I had to explain it in a sentence, it would be the art of finding and enjoying what connects us more than what divides us. And that chemistry is foundational to being able to actually seek and accomplish the common ground that is needed to resolve complex issues. But we also have to be willing to compete. And competition means being able to engage with each other at controversial subjects in intense fora and actually seek to achieve what it is that what we need, we want. We have to be able to advance our positions, advance our interests, and compete with each other. But we have to do it with dignity, with grace, and with graciousness. Because ultimately, we all win by accomplishing goals together. So competition is more about how we compete than it is about the specific outcome. And that brings up civility. Civility is one of the core principles, one of the core concepts at the Henry Clay Center. But it's not about agreeing all the time, about being demure all the time, about being nice to each other, about making everything seem placid. It is about intense, robust discourse, engagement, interaction, but where there is mutual respect and there is understanding and appreciation of the dignity of all stakeholders, all interlocutors, and all people. To engage in this process of communication, in the competition to achieve our needs and interests, in pursuit of the chemistry and the civility that will resolve our disputes, we come to the last concept that came out of last month's discussion: courage. We have to be willing to take on the most challenging issues, to face those issues within ourselves, and to communicate what we see in each other. And that courage is foundational to actually addressing issues and not just pushing them forward. At the Henry Clay Center, we are constantly working to live up to those principles, and part of that requires us to constantly reflect on the legacy of Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay was actually my 5 times great-grandfather, so for me, this is both a personal and professional interest. But I think it is important to recognize that legacy is not one-sided. It is not about what good legacy we can achieve or look to. It's about looking at the full legacy. And over the last year in particular, we have really sought to do that. We've sought to look at, yes, Henry Clay was the great compromiser. Yes, he was incredibly adept at diplomacy, at debate, and at compromise. But he also owned slaves. He enslaved human beings throughout his life. And in his politics and policy, he advanced and in some ways extended the institution of slavery for decades. So that legacy is not uniform in its in the heritage we take today. So in order to both address that legacy and celebrate the elements of it that can help us to confront our most problematic issues in society today, we embrace that complexity as being demonstrative of the overarching complexity of American history and the contradiction in our very founding. I am delighted then to introduce today's discussion, because I think there is probably no more complex issue, no more foundational question, and no more important topic to be discussing than racial justice. And if it comes to solving America's most challenging issues, this is first and foremost among them, because it is perhaps the first and foremost problem we created when this country was established. So it is my pleasure to welcome an incredible panel to join me in this conversation. And I really hope that over the next 50 minutes or so, we will not only have a good conversation, but we will start to look at how we can apply some of the skills and values that we were talking about last month in the Craft of Compromise to actually bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice, towards actually moving the needle, towards really resolving some of these foundational issues in our society, and not just continuing to pay lip service to issues that have existed throughout our history. So let me welcome the other panelists, and I am delighted to have the chance to speak with them about this key issue. First, I am delighted to introduce Terrence Sullivan. He is the Executive Director at the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights, and he is the co-founder of Anti-Racism Kentucky. His co-founder, Dr. O.J. Aleka, also attached to Anti-Racism Kentucky, is the president of the Association of Independent Kentucky Colleges and Universities. Tirzah Tippin-Poe is a lecturer at Harvard University and a fellow member of the Henry Clay Center for Board of Directors. Gabriella Wells is one of our distinguished alums, and she is a 2020 graduate of the University of Mississippi. And like her colleague, Jordan Davis, who was a student in the 2019 Student Congress of the Henry Clay Center, she will be heading to law school this autumn. And finally, Jordan Davis, who is a 2020 graduate of Morehouse College, is currently a student at Columbia University in New York, and will also be going to law school later this year. So to the team, welcome. Let me start where we started last month, with defining our terms. We talked about compromise last month, and we started with the definition of compromise. This month, we are talking about racial justice. So what is racial justice? Terrence, as a fellow lawyer, I'm going to turn to you first.
So that's a difficult question. It means something different to everyone. And I think from my own personal perspective, and you said we have 50 minutes, so I'll try to be very brief. But racial justice. So when this country was started, we were based on a premise or a set of principles that claim to stand on this bedrock of equality and freedom. And our pledge to the flag even talks about liberty and justice for all. And so in doing that, we created this starting point that we've never lived up to. Generations of people, especially Black people and others, have suffered at the hands of the system. And there's deep-seated systemic racism and inequities that disadvantaged communities of color have seen woven into the fabric of our institutions today. That's in education, housing, the criminal legal system. And we see segregation and injustice in housing and in schools. And we also have systems that at the same time that they increase poverty, they also on the back end criminalize that very poverty and the situations that stem from poverty. So to me, racial justice is settling the score, so to speak, creating a space where we don't have those inequities, or we've developed systems that intentionally dismantle them. As someone growing up here, and as we grow up in general, we hear about how great America is and how it's this land of freedom and opportunity. And so for me, racial justice is when I or someone who looks like me And pretty much everyone who looks like me and others who don't fit that view that was envisioned by the framers is able to experience that America, and for it to be a place that loves me and loves us the way that we want to love it. And so racial justice to me is a world or an existence where the inequities that were designed to hold people back, maybe they're not completely eradicated, but there are systems in place that acknowledge their existence and creates a path forward and making sure that we all can experience this America that we've been taught about since we were children.
It was an absolutely beautiful answer. It sounds like there are, in other words, two aspects to it. There's an objective or institutional systemic aspect, and then there's an experiential aspect. And the two of them need to line up, because right now the processes of the system, the institutions, aren't lining up with the experience of fairness, of equity, of justice for all. And I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. Does anyone else want to comment on that definitional question before we really get into the heat of how to address this?
I'd like to. We can get into the heat now. Of course, Terrence and I are good co-founders and good friends and have been for quite some time. And we approach this from a different political perspective, which again is the heart of what we're doing here. And the reason why I bring that up is because I approach this from a conservative lens. That is my background philosophically. That is how I look at things politically. What are the conservative principles from Burke to Kirk to any of the great conservative thinkers on this particular issue? And from this, I will pull from Adam Smith. Racial justice is in fact justice. And when you look at it from that context, it means that everybody, as Terrence mentioned, is treated equally from the start. Now we know that in this country, unfortunately, and Terrence laid it out, that hasn't been the case. So what that means is that one, you have to change that immediately. You have to rectify those challenges, but then also provide the resources both internally within the communities, but also rip away and strip away the barriers that might exist so people can't live out their God-given potential. And from a conservative perspective, we think and we talk and we believe a lot in liberty. There is nothing related to liberty if someone cannot achieve the full American experience because they are kept back because of some government-imposed barrier or because of some business-imposed barrier or some of community-imposed barriers. Redlining, the process where banks and local governments got together based on federal law to keep out Black folks from owning homes, is a clear example of being anti-liberty, and therefore it is racist and anti-conservative. There is a great deal of belief in the history of conservative thinkers and leaders in politics in the United States, particularly the radical Republicans who gave us a few of my favorite amendments to the Constitution, where they believed very clearly that the government must act to provide liberty. The government must act to protect civil rights. This is not a stretch from conservative orthodoxy, far from it. In fact, it lives right in the heart of it. So again, this is where you can have a difference of philosophy, but when it's right, it's right. And so you reach the end conclusion in a way that I think is most important.
It couldn't be said better. So I will take what you've just said and pair it with two quotes. I think over the last year we've been bombarded with quotes from Martin Luther King in particular about racial justice, and I mentioned one already. Everyone loves to quote that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But we don't often quote some of the other more controversial, perhaps, things that Martin Luther King said. And in particular, I make a habit of rereading on a regular basis a letter from Birmingham jail, because I think it is an incredibly important reminder that we cannot be complacent. And there's a quote from it that I want to share to kick off the discussion, or at least extend the discussion. He says, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So that begs the question, is racial justice possible in our lifetime?
I love to answer that. As a native Birminghamian and a fellow Morehouse graduate, I feel definitely prepared to answer the question. But I think racial justice fundamentally is a manifestation of truth in action. And so it's an acknowledgement of the truth of the harms and the ills that have been perpetuated and that have been really used against people of color in particular. But after that acknowledgement, there has to be a next phase where we jump into action. And I think most of the time we're stuck in that truth, in that conversation phase. And we need to really push our fellow brothers and sisters to engage in the action part, because words are beautiful, but action is supreme. And so I fundamentally believe that we have to move past the think pieces and the conversations and actually work toward making an impact, a long-term impact.
If I were asked this a year or two ago, I definitely would have said, yes, it's definitely possible in our lifetime. I would have said it would be a struggle, but we definitely can get there. But that was before some of the more recent events that we've seen in this country, in the state, and in my city. And the responses that followed some of those things were humbling, inspiring, and sobering. So we saw some of the events that preceded some protests, and we saw the inspiration it created, and we also saw the responses that came from those. We saw commitments to diversity, commitments to equity, commitments to inclusion. But then we saw even more growth in opposition to some of these things. We saw election challenges that wanted to undo Black votes. We saw states and school districts passing policies to discourage the teachings of the true origins of our country or our racist past. And I think that Jordan just said it about understanding our history and the ills and the ills. And we have seen some places run the opposite direction to completely go around those and not be honest about where we are, where we've been. As we are sitting here talking, there are efforts in places like Georgia, which saw record turnout for Black voters, to then fight to suppress those same voters for the next go round. And so there's this proof that I see that there's a mentality that goes beyond just simple solutions and things that we can really achieve quickly. So that's why I think we have more than our lifetime to completely address the issue. Some of these notions of racism and inequities are deeply seated that they'll take so much time to address. And does that mean I don't think we'll get to a place where we are better than we are? No, I don't think that. I'm positive. I'm confident that we will. And I actually think that we've seen so much movement that we will get there faster than people ever deemed possible. I know faster than I ever thought possible. The very fact that we're here right now is proof of that this is a conversation that people want to have.
Do others want?
Is it okay if I jump in?
Please, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me here today. I am honored to hear the remarks of my fellow panelists already and have taken copious notes, and just thank you for those thoughts. I want to build on them, and especially the last thought from Terrence about, what kind of progress can we make, and this idea that, we've got this foundation. As I've said in a recent board meeting at the Henry Clay Center, this country is based on the annihilation of one people, mine, and the enslavement of another. And that acknowledgement of harm has to occur, and it has not occurred in the United States. We have other models in other countries like Truth and Reconciliation in Canada and other countries that have gone through this process. I would propose a model that says we have acknowledgement of that harm, and then we deconstruct and decode all the things that we're talking about. For instance, compromise. According to who? Whose definition of compromise? Whose definition of civil discourse? And those are structures that have been put into place hundreds of years ago by the architects of racial inequality, and they're not people of color. We are the ones who are experiencing racial inequality as people of color. We are not the architects of it. So I think we need to have that deconstruction and decoding of the terms that are used right now. I know as an Indigenous person, my lived experience growing up in my home village of Utqiagvik at the edge of the Arctic Ocean, when colonialization came, which we were the last to be touched by the colonialization that started on the East Coast 600 years prior, we did not know the code. We didn't even know the words. I'm the first English speaker out of my village as my first language, as the first language. So decoding of what the colonialists, which are the architects of racial inequality in the United States, was a big focus of my grandmother and my mother, and continues in my work consulting and teaching and speaking. So I'm going to wrap this by saying, so I think that acknowledgement of harm needs to happen at a national level. And then we need to talk about decoding these terms that are used, and they're used to silence voices, powerful voices. Oh, be civil. I've heard that many times. And then we need to develop a dialogue based on a common understanding of this after we decode hundreds of years of this architecture of racial inequality, and have that debate, an open debate, and not in just rooms like this, although I agree, this is a great start. And then we need to wrestle to the ground what we commonly define as compromise, because I've yet to see a definition, and I've yet to see a definition of racial justice, although I think I heard a couple today that are better than any I've heard before. We need to commonly agree to what compromise looks like. That's one model.
Well, I'll just say, I think this is exactly what we want to be wrestling with at the Henry Clay Center. And this is why we started with the question of what is compromise last time, what is racial justice this time. We need to revisit all the concepts that we assume we know, because, and this isn't just true of societal problems. I think it's a good practice to constantly be reflecting on assumptions, because what we have perhaps seen most acutely is that some of the assumptions that are built into our society are fundamentally wrong. And so we need to start reflecting and looking back in order to change those assumptions. And I certainly have worked really hard as a Henry Clay descendant to look back on his legacy as a personal matter and question the assumptions I have built into my my family narrative.
May I jump in real quick?
Please, I was about to turn to you.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you. I really enjoyed everyone else's responses, and I definitely agree with what Terrence said. As far as the question, is racial justice achievable within our lifetime? I agree that it's not. Is it achievable? Yes, but within our lifetime, no. And the reason I say that's because we've had so many setbacks. Now, with what Jordan said, saying we need to move towards action, I agree. But I think before we get to the step of action, like with what Terza says, we need to step back into that step of discussion, of understanding. And I say that because when I think of in the scope of my generation, there's so much misunderstanding of what we mean by we need diversity, we need equity, we need equality. People throw those words around, but they're thinking of it from their own perspective. They're not thinking of it from the same perspective. So when you go at it from that, no one knows what goal we're trying to reach. I think we all need to figure out exactly what we mean by when we're using those words and how we can reach that. But it's going to take a while before we understand that, because one, a lot of people aren't doing their own research or learning. They're just going based off the thoughts pushed on them from their parents. Their parents were born from a different generation, and they got those thoughts from a different generation in which people were enslaved. People owned slaves. They built their wealth from the backs of people who were pushed down. They're not using their own minds to get an understanding of what these minority groups are trying to reach. And I think that's causing a lot of harm in this. So within reaching that goal within our lifetime, no, but I do believe that before we can push forward and make more action, which I think my generation has been using their voice to speak up, as we've seen with all the protests within the past year, the marches, it's wonderful. But until we all come to a complete understanding of this is what we mean by this, we don't want to cause harm. We're just trying to reach the same goal. We're never going to reach that thing. And another problem is when people are uncomfortable, they don't want to listen. They would rather silence you, oppress you, and then just walk away. They don't want to enter those conversations because one, they're worried that their livelihoods are going to be hurt, where their standing is going to be hurt. And if you're worried that your status in society is going to be pushed down, of course, you're not going to listen to the little voices speaking up at you, even though what those voices saying will impact your livelihood. And so I think that's something else we need to figure out, how to get these conversations to where people aren't uncomfortable, they're willing to listen, or if they are uncomfortable, they're willing to say, okay, I can push this aside because I realize this affects me too, and I want to be a helper. And then they need to ask, how can I help you without sounding ignorant, or how can I help you without causing more harm? Those are also questions we need to ask when we're going to this discussion.
Does anybody else want to try to answer some of those questions? Because I think they are foundational to what Jordan said earlier about actually making progress. How do we move the discussion to action, and how do we overcome those hurdles to actually making real progress?
Well, I think discomfort is good. And actually, we'll give this example. You may be able to hear my daughter in the background. She is 9 months and a couple weeks old. I don't think it's any secret to say that how she got here in terms of my wife and the Herculean effort she gave in birthing her was more than discomfort, was more than uncomfortable. But out of discomfort, out of uncomfortable conversations and actions can produce beautiful things. My daughter is just an example of that, but you can use the example of working out. If you want to get healthy or get fit, you want to go on a run or you want to lift some weights, sometimes that's uncomfortable. Again, those might sound like silly examples or ones that don't play out here, but the reason why I bring them up is because they're incredibly important. Just because you are uncomfortable doesn't mean something good isn't happening. And I think with this specific conversation, those folks who may be more difficult in terms of having this discussion, it's important, it's useful. In that sense of defensiveness that is coming up in your craw and your gut, that's okay. That's a normal thing. Don't stay there, as my colleagues have said, but understand that it is a part of the process. Don't let it push you away from having an important conversation. And to try and answer one of the questions, this is a conversation about power. And this was alluded to before, giving up power or shifting power or sharing power, which I think is a more accurate way to look at it, is a difficult thing to do, but it ultimately makes each of us better. It makes society better. I can point to a number of research articles that tell you it actually makes us richer. There was a study that came out from the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco that over the past 20 years, if there was parity with racial employment, basically black folks, people of color, if they worked at the same levels, at the same hours, at the same pay as their white peers, we could have trillions of dollars more of economic output into the economy. So if you ain't doing it because it's the right thing, do it because it'll make you more money. Now, again, that's a secondary goal. I want to make that clear. But being uncomfortable and experiencing discomfort isn't bad, except that it's part of the process, and let's move forward together.
I agree with you, OJ, on that. I just think we have to think about, like, a lot of Americans, they're not really self-aware enough to stop and ask themselves, okay, I'm uncomfortable. What is this stemming from? We like to believe they are, or that they're willing to be. And the people we talk to, some of them are like, yes, I think about that, or yes, I do agree. But just think about the common American person who's really going to stop and think, I'm uncomfortable. Let me dig into this, figure out the reason why, move forward. No, they're going to say, I'm uncomfortable, I'm shutting my ears, and I'm leaving. And that is a problem that we have to figure out a way to fix.
Agreed 100%.
Likewise, and I think, we talked actually about this a little bit last month. Our education system actually tries to push everyone away from ever experiencing discomfort or challenge or tension. Or it is incredible how much we try to safeguard children from experiencing discomfort. So are we crippling our future by not actually embracing that discomfort more at a young age?
So I think excellent comment by OJ. Just because we're uncomfortable doesn't mean good things aren't happening. But I think what you characterize as your secondary point is actually the leading point to solve what Gabriella just brought up. So we'd love to believe that everybody wants to do the right thing and figure out why they're uncomfortable. And I say this often when I talk about vulnerable communities and Indigenous people, but in fact, where we see real change around the world in the large scale projects I work on is when we make the right value proposition to people, when we hit them where they live, which is the value proposition you just outlined. I think there's a misconception that in the United States, I'm going to deal with just the US in this discussion, that the pie is fixed. So if people of color get more of X, fill in the blank, then that takes away from the white people. I think simply put, that's the formula that is in a lot of the heads that Gabriella so aptly described, the people who aren't self-reflective. And that doesn't mean they're bad people. It means there's been a lot of conditioning and it's resulted in their head of this model that if somebody else gets something, then that pie is smaller, that it's a fixed pie. So I think discussing more and more what you've outlined, OJ, the massive amount of research we're seeing that shows diversity on every layer leads to more profitability, better decision-making. And we're certainly seeing in corporate America, and frankly, financing for your project is tied to that. So at a very fundamental level. Knowing all of that, if we can boil that down to a value proposition to people who aren't self-reflective and say, you know what, it's not about taking something from you. All boats raise, or whatever I'm sure there's a marine person. Oh yes.
A rising tide lifts all boats. Yes.
Anyway, I wholeheartedly agree with your comments, and I just wanted to say I think you're onto something with that value proposition.
Let me turn that around and ask a question though. Is it possible then to achieve racial justice without eradicating racism? Because if what we're looking at is actually finding a value proposition that is not based on doing what's right, but doing the right thing for different reasons, can we eradicate racial injustice without eradicating racism?
Well, I'm going to jump on that one and then I'll stop talking. Yes and no. We have a great example in real life of how the economic engine of a fifth of the United States is now being led by Indigenous people, my people, Alaska Native people. The largest employer, the state of Alaska, multi-billion-dollar corporations that do investment around the world. And we did that in 50 years. We turned that around from being colonized to now leading most of the investment that comes out of Alaska and most of the employment that happens within Alaska. And most of that employment is not people of color. So think about that. So we went from not being able, when I was a little girl, to go into certain stores, no natives, no dogs was the sign when I was a kid, to holding all the receptions that everybody wants to come to. Now, is that a bit, I know where you're going, it should be the right thing to do, but by changing that economic paradigm and achieving economic parity and then exceeding that and actually leading the economics of a region has opened a lot of non-Indigenous eyes. And we've seen that switch in 50 years. So I would argue, I guess, in the nicest way possible, that having economic control is a powerful motivator for changing not only society, but society's beliefs about itself.
Terrence, I think you wanted to jump in.
Well, I think, unfortunately, that's accurate, that the economic driver can get us there, depending on what the destination is. That's the sad reality. But to answer that question about achieving some racial justice without eradicating racism, I think yes and no is the best way to say it, because we can, in theory, try to tackle a lot of the systemic issues through different mechanisms. But and that might achieve some of the long-term goals that we need and that we wish to see. However, racism, that's someone's heart, and we can't change that. So if the driver is economic and not compassion for those other individuals, we're not going to get rid of racism. We're just going to put a band-aid over it and have some positive outcomes, but have those deep-seated, widely held views that just may not be on the surface, because people do respect the color of green more than the color of their counterparts. And then I wanted to jump back just real quickly to the great point that Gabriella brought up, and your follow-up question about if we are crippling students or children by avoiding conflict and discomfort and all of that. And I immediately thought of the first comments that Terza made about defining things and framing things, because I think that might be true for non-white students and children, because I know for me personally, most of the spaces where I existed, I was told, anything that's happening or what people are saying, you can't internalize it too much and react. So you just have to learn to deal with it and try to persevere, try to push through. People are going to see you as different, but you have to be the better person. You have to learn how to work with others who don't understand you. And so there are a lot of people who are taught that from as soon as you can understand whatever your native language is. But then we're always taught, again, to Terza's point, we're taught to understand those things on someone else's terms. And so are we crippling our children in that way? Yeah, probably, but some of them, not all, because some of us are made to learn how to exist in another world and to approach things where civil discourse or compromise means we're trying to be more agreeable or amenable to what other people who are different than us really want, and try to find a way to fit us into them, as opposed to finding a way for us to fit together.
OJ, I think you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, I'll quickly add, because I think Tirza, Terrence, Gabrielle, all these points kind of roll together in the thought that I had. Black Wall Street. We're 100 years away now from Tulsa and the race riots that destroyed a black community that was incredibly prosperous, some 2 generations after black folks were enslaved in this country. I think that's an example of when you try to do at least racial economic justice or racial economic opportunity without addressing racism. Now, again, for those of you who don't know, Black Wall Street, again, this was a community in Tulsa, Greenwood, Oklahoma specifically, where there was incredible black economic success. Black communities were thriving because of some incident, again, that was racially charged, that in fact was later recanted. There were literal terrorist attacks on this community. It's the only time there's ever been an air raid on the United States soil, and it was done domestically, locally, by white terrorists who destroyed a black community. There were no prosecutions. No one went to prison. It was just sort of accepted and then covered up. Many folks probably hadn't heard this today. So when Gabriella says that she's concerned that it can't happen in her lifetime, this is why. Because of something like Black Wall Street. Because immediately when you see some success financially or economically, it can be destroyed. If, and this is the key part, the state must protect our civil rights. Again, it goes back to this idea of justice. Because if everybody who was involved in that riot was swiftly prosecuted, put in prison for life, thrown in the jail, under the jail, then there at least creates a deterrent. Racism is a sickness. It's a social disease. Again, as Terrence pointed out, it's something that's in your heart. But if you can create a deterrent and an equal justice system around the idea that anybody who perpetuates it, anybody who supports it, anybody who believes that it is the right thing to do, faces criminal prosecution, you certainly do a great job. And then hopefully over the generations, again, as Gabriella mentioned, people are saying and learning different things. Grandparents teach their kids or their grandkids different things. Parents teach their kids different things, and so on in the subsequent generations. So it takes time, but it is required that the state play its role in making sure that people can thrive and that they're not going to be destroyed just because they're doing well financially.
I think the economic point raises a concern that I've spoken to a couple of you about in the past. We've really come to focus on the expression Black Lives Matter. It should be uncontroversial. It should just be a truism. It has been controversial, but that's not really what I want to focus on. I want to look at whether we are running the risk of changing that into Black Lives Have Value by focusing on the economic piece. And unfortunately, Black lives having value is the very genesis of slavery in the first place. And so I think we need to be very careful. My own point from where I sit and the perspective of my own background is that we need to be very careful not to associate lives mattering with an economic value. I think I certainly take the points about how we fix the systemic issues in terms of making sure that there are repeatable, documentable processes that produce equivalent effect for all Americans, regardless of skin color, race, creed, background, any kind of differentiation. But if we try to focus on economic only initiatives or primarily economic initiatives, we lose somewhat of the plot, which is, I think, that we need to recognize the common humanity in each other and the values and principles that were enshrined in the founding documents of the country that have never really existed in reality. Not from just an institutional or structural standpoint, but from a mentality standpoint. And that, I think, is really important. So I'd love your thoughts on that, as whether we are running the risk of mixing mattering as a truism and value as an economic function. I
think, yes, we run that risk. I also think that people can hold more than one thought in their head at a time. And so, you know, economic for Indigenous people, especially, and that's arguably the lens I come from. You know, we weren't living past 50 in the 70s, the 1970s. So having running water and economic access to being able to have a flush toilet has increased the length of our lives by 75 years. I am not saying that, and I say value proposition because I use that. It can also mean what I think is the larger point that OJ said, which is the state must protect our civil rights. So I'll use the example I used before to keep it short. We have economic parity, except we exceeded economic parity in our region for one group of Indigenous people. But what really transformed our lives, and this came 20 years after, was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now you have a rights instrument to affect not only economic change, which you need, but all these other changes that need to happen. You've got this umbrella of the state, in this case, it's the UN, protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And, you know, we've yet to do that in the United States. I go back to my original comment of acknowledgement of harm. Not sure I answered your question, but that's where I would.
No, I think you make very salient points to what I was talking about, but I also think you're absolutely right that we often segment out what problem we are trying to deal with by race, and so it isn't racial justice writ large. It is racial justice for African Americans, for Asian Americans, for Native Americans, and we aren't looking at the phenomenon as a whole. So I think that is a very, very salient and important point.
Well, it's context driven. So one of the traps that we fall into, especially in academia, I find, and I'm not an academic, I come from large scale resource development around the world. I've worked with vulnerable communities from, you know, Colombia to Iraq, is this trap of not considering the context. So the context of Kentucky is very different than the context of Alaska. And the only way you understand that, so you can design these, you know, let's address racial justice writ large, but in fact, it will not have meaning unless you acknowledge the local context within which you are trying to achieve racial justice. Now, how do you do that? That means you have to go talk to people. You have to talk to the people who are most deeply impacted by racial inequity. That means people of color. And you have to say to them, walk in the door, this is the hardest thing you do, and say, what does this look like to you? Not what my idea is sitting in some corner office on the East Coast or from anywhere in Sweden or anywhere. So local matters. Actually, local is where the change happens. That context is key to success. We need the broad umbrella of rights, but under the cover of that, these solutions are going to be contextual, which makes it complex, but also forces you to work with people instead of saying, okay, we've got that done. We've written that. We know how to solve racism now. Right?
Absolutely.
I'd love to jump in here, Ian,
Please do.
if I may.
Yeah.
So I think of racism as a cancer, and I think oftentimes we've used medicine, we've used bandages when it requires chemotherapy, right? And so my issue with the economic driver being a factor in achieving racial justice, it can easily come off as a symptom of the colonizer virus or the colonizer mindset. And we can start to retract and redact into this colonizer mindset of exploitation, of dividing, of conquering, because economics has a way of doing that to people. We've seen it time and time again in our nation's history. And so I'm so glad that you brought up the point that of running the risk of adding value in a way that is not seen as a liberation in the terms of value, but in terms of a price tag on Black lives. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I do think that we fundamentally run the risk of having a colonizer mindset show up and present itself again.
I'm sorry.
No, I was actually going to turn to you.
Real quick comment, kind of going off of what Jordan said with that. I completely agree, because I worry that if we start to use that type of language of, Black lives have a value versus matter, then that could really be a big social blow, because you don't know what that word value means to the African American community. Because 400 years ago, when they just brought us here, all they saw were dollar signs and what could be made off of our backs. So you don't know the emotional toll that holds on you, especially when you are raised by your grandmother, your great grandmother, who actually saw this firsthand from their parents, hearing the stories, still have the scars on their skin. There's a emotional toll that brings on you, and that we have to bring into in the workforce, in the school force, when we have to deal with our white counterparts. So we have to be very careful about the type of language we use. And that also goes back to getting the same foundation of what each word means and what our goal is when we use this type of language. So I definitely want us to be very careful when we're using that type of language.
Ian, too, this debate isn't new when you think about the conversation that we're having. I mean, this was a debate that W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington had in terms of the Black community specifically, when they were talking about social or socio-political growth, that would be the Du Bois perspective, and then economic opportunity, that would be the Booker T. Washington perspective. So the idea of Washington's Atlanta Expo speech, cast down your buckets here. A lot of folks could have a lot of problems with that. So the debate continued, again, obviously in the mid-20th century, when you had King talking about liberal integrationism, again, this idea of working together hand in hand. And then you had Malcolm X talking about Black nationalism. So the debate within the Black community, I think it's one that continues on and on. The word that I might use to think about this more explicit, at least to my point, again, as Gabriella pointed out, you got to define things. Agency. Does the Black person, the Black family, the Black community, do they have their own agency? So when I think about do we matter, it's that question. Am I in control of my own destiny? When I walk out of my home, do I feel safe? Do I walk out of my home? Do I feel like I can go to work and make equal pay to anybody else doing the same work that I'm doing? Can my kids go to a great school? Can we worship at the place that we want to worship? Can we live the lives that we want to live? Full and total agency over who I am and who my people are. Again, my people, to define that, could be spouse, could be family, could be my community. But as long as the agency is equal across the board, what we ought to be doing, I think, at least the way that I would define it, is whatever it takes to get there. That way we can achieve real equity and real equality because we've got true agency.
I think you've put that absolutely beautifully. And I think it goes into my final question, because unfortunately we're running out of time. If racism is a cancer. Chemo is a very uncompromising treatment for it. It is intense, and it is partly killing the person who holds the cancer as well as the cancer itself. It's incredibly aggressive. How can we approach this debate and turn it into action such that we are really going forward from here? What do we do to make sure that this is not a one-off? How do we carry this forward? And what can the Henry Clay Center do to contribute to that in a meaningful way?
The onus has always been on the minority to make the majority feel comfortable. And it's just part of being in America in this time, in this space. We've always had to be the one to step back, hold our tongues, make you comfortable so you will listen to us so we can move forward. And that's not going to change anytime soon as much as we want it to. Maybe in a few generations from now, when our children's children have learned the different ways of speaking and thinking, then they will be able to approach the table, not have to hold back who they are in their own way of manner of speaking, and be able to speak to someone of the opposite race and they will listen to them the same way. But from this moment on, it's just about reaching out to those people who, although they don't want to listen, they want to ignore you, getting them to come sit at the table and just being able to get them to listen to you, get them to be willing to hear you and accept the words you're saying, and then create a dialogue. But it's just figuring out the steps to get to that point while making each person not too uncomfortable to the point where they're willing to leave the table, but they are willing to reach out a hand and say, okay, I'll give you a chance.
I think what Gabriella just said is pretty much a perfect summation of what I was going to say. But I think to your question about what the Henry Clay Center could do, I say this for anyone looking to get involved and to help make a change, is one, identify where your strengths are and what you can contribute to making change, but also utilize your networks and your resources, because as Gabriella was saying, and what I hope to allude to earlier about us having to learn to deal with being uncomfortable and working in a world that wasn't created for us, people who do exist in that space and have that privilege of the world being more crafted to work with them, to use that position and that privilege to enlighten others or to help others be party to the conversation or be understanding or be vulnerable enough to want to learn and grow. Because we, and I can't speak for every person of color, but it's so hard to have to be the expert, the victim, and the way out. It's tiring, and it also is hard sometimes to get that buy-in from someone who isn't on that same side. And so anytime you can pick up allies and people who can help get in that space and speak and translate it from that space, but to be able to come to an understanding and create a definition or a framework that's collectively created, that is much more meaningful and has the ability to affect more lasting change.
Assata Shakur once said, "It is our duty to fight for freedom, and it is our duty to win." And when I think of this question, I almost instantly think of duty. And what does that look like? We all have a duty. We all have a shared, or we're supposed to have a shared responsibility in this work. And so I would encourage people to look up how they show up in the world. What does their positionality look like? Which I think is what Terrence was getting at. What does solidarity look like? And how can I really use the body that I show up in, or how I present myself in the world, to enact change? So I think, to allude to something that Gabriella said earlier, it's about self-introspection and how you can use your thoughts from your time alone to really impact the world.
OJ, do you want to give a final thought?
I just have two thoughts. I would say embrace discomfort and remain hopeful. My parents came to the United States from Nigeria. My father came here from abject poverty, lived the American dream, put 3 kids through college. I know that we can make changes in this country because I've seen it. My family has lived it. And while we might not get it done in my lifetime, I'm hopeful that we can achieve these goals in Gabriella's lifetime, because she's younger than me, and also my daughter's lifetime, because it's too important. There are too many people who we value, who we love, who we need to get this right for. So I'd say embrace discomfort and remain hopeful.
Beautifully put. And Tirzah, final thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know what I can add to that other than embrace discomfort is my new motto, and I'm going to put it on a t-shirt. It is exhausting. Thank you for saying that. Being probably older than everybody else. I'm not pulling the age card. I'm so glad you're here. I just got to say that as my final thought. And being vulnerable enough to learn was brilliant, Gabriella. And if I could say that to all my white people friends, we really can't do all the heavy lifting on this. I'm just, it's too exhausting. So it's got to be borne by, as Terrence said, we can't do all of those roles all the time.
I think it's incredibly well put. Well, from my end, I will tell you that the Henry Clay Center remains committed to doing everything it can to continue to facilitate dialogue and discourse around the most complicated, challenging, and important issues of the society. And racial justice will remain a theme going forward for as long as it takes, which according to some of you will be for the remainder of my lifetime and onwards. So we will continue. And I personally want to thank all of you because I have really heard things today that help inspire that process of introspection, of reflection, of self-searching in order to be more engaged and to look for what meaningful action, not just words, not just thoughts, that I can take in my own life and throughout my career. And I hope that those watching will have had a similar experience of inspiration. And I appreciate all of you for having provided that opportunity. So many thanks to all of you. It is now my honor and pleasure to welcome Tom Shelton, the director of the Henry Clay Center, who joined us just last summer after a very long and distinguished career in education. Tom actually came out of retirement in order to be able to take up this role. So Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you so much to all the panelists once more. I look forward to our next event.
Hello, as you heard, my name is Tom Shelton, and I am very honored to serve as the Executive Director of the Henry Clay Center. We'd like to say a big thank you to the members of our panel for engaging in a conversation about this difficult issue. We'd also like to thank Dr. Ian Rawlby from the Henry Clay Center Board, who is also a direct descendant of Henry Clay, for serving as the moderator. The Henry Clay Center is a nonprofit, bipartisan organization. Since 2007, our mission has focused on civility, discourse, and compromise. We desire to transform the tone of our country's national discourse. We do not seek to change partisan minds, but rather to inspire current and future leaders to emulate the political legacy of Henry Clay by listening to each other, debating matters of significance, and finding common ground through compromise. In addition to events like the Craft of Compromise series, the Henry Clay Center holds annual Student Congress events for college and high school students. Alumni of our Student Congress events now number over 700 and serve in a variety of professions, including as elected state and local officials, staffers in the U.S. House and Senate, and corporate and legal professionals in the private sector. If you want to learn more about the Henry Clay Center and help us by supporting our programs and events, please visit henryclaycenter.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Our future Craft of Compromise events will feature topics such as the economic realities of Wall Street versus Main Street and military involvement in foreign policy. I encourage you to visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel to see future Craft of Compromise and other events. Thank you for engaging with us, and stay tuned.